I've made 2 videos now about roads in London which used to have a large number of pubs lined along them and now have barely any. Oxford Street, once 27 pubs, now only 1. And the Old Kent Road, once 37 pubs, now just 2. So that prompted Boogie Stew on X to ask which road in London has the most pubs on it now. It's a great question and one I don't think has been answered before. Googling for it, I found which boroughs in London had the most pubs, but not which road. So I set about trying to answer this question myself. Once you get into the details of it, it does start to get a bit philosophical. What exactly do you mean by London? What is a pub? What is a road? For the first question, I'm going to assume we're talking about Greater London here. For the second question, I have done a whole video on what is a pub. For that third question, what is a road? It sounds really straightforward, doesn't it? But it's actually quite hard to pin down. First of all, I will say it has to be a named road, not just a number. Now, road names do, of course, get reused in London. I found a great article by someone called Diamond Geezer, I'll put a link to that in the description, who has counted all of the different high streets in Greater London, and there are 57 of those. Now, of course, they are all different independent streets. The High Street in Wimbledon has nothing to do with the High Street in Wembley. The third point I'd like to make, and now here is where it does get a bit thorny, is that some long distance routes in London, like the Great North Road, hopefully you can see that up there, take different names locally along their route. So I think there's at least 3 different ways to do the counting here, and each of those will give us a different answer depending on what exactly we mean by a road. For all 3 methods, I'm going to be making use of CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ales, online pub guide, camera.org.uk/pubs. From that, I've been able to get a list of all of the venues that they very broadly consider to be a pub in the Greater London area, something like 5,000 of them. We will need to whittle that down a little bit later to things that we really genuinely believe are pubs, but it's a good start. The first answer that we can come up with is based on counting those mega roads, as I like to call them, roads like the Great North Road, in their entirety, including all the pubs where the name of the road changes locally. The Great North Road starts down in the City of London, later on it becomes Islington High Street, then later on still it's Upper Street, later again Archway Road, later again Highgate Road, you get the idea. But there are sections that are just called the Great North Road, like this section here in East Finchley, where I am now at the Old White Lion. So if we count the Great North Road within Greater London in its entirety, including all the local name changes, then there are 56 venues listed on CAMRA's website, and I would say about 45 of those are genuinely pubs. But the road has changed names locally at least a dozen times during that stretch. Somehow that doesn't feel entirely satisfying to me as an answer. I don't think many people would consider the Great North Road to be a single road in the same spirit as, say, Oxford Street is or the Old Kent Road is. I think we might need to try a different way of counting. While I'm here at the Old White Lion in East Finchley, can't resist taking a quick look at the pub itself. It's a 1930s bit of mock Tudor. The original pub building was demolished when the railway lines here at East Finchley were widened to make room for a larger station and an additional line. There's some nice carving on the beams of these large gables here, a classic grapevine pattern. There's some plasterwork moulding around the doors and windows, including a lion above one of the entrances, and one of those gables features a projecting oriel window with crisscross shaped leaded panes. Inside it's mostly modernised, but I thought at least 1 or 2 of these fireplaces had a bit of that mock Tudor charm. We saw something similar at the Griffin in Whetstone. There are bits of, I believe, 1930s stained glass around various parts of the pub. At the entrance vestibule, this depiction of a white lion, and then elsewhere in the upper panes in the windows that now look out over the garden. Records for the pub go back to at least the 1820s. Here's an excerpt from court proceedings from 1825. There is a great photo of it on the pub's history website showing its prior incarnation before that 1930s rebuild. I would guess this is from the early 1900s, looking particularly at that Holloway Empire poster over to the left-hand side of the image. The Holloway Empire was built in 1899. You can see here how it abuts part of the railway bridge, forming the entrance into East Finchley Station, and of course that was the reason for the original pub building's demise. You can see that precarious location next to the railway lines on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. The yard behind it and its location facing onto the Great North Road, which would of course have been a major coaching route, suggests to me that this is a one-time coaching inn. And for comparison, here is the mid-1900s OS map. Today it's a Mitchell and Butler's pub, part of their Castle brand. I've gone for a pint of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. They did also have Harvey Sussex Best on the bar, but that was alas off at this time. But 2 out of the 3 beers, definitely things that I like there. The other option is to only count pubs towards the total for that road, where the name of the road is in the address of the pub. So going back to CAMRA's online pub guide, we can go through those 5,000 or so venues and with a bit of jiggery pokery take out the road or street names, and we get a top 10 which looks a bit like this. Well, I say top 10, it's actually 12 because there are 5 different roads or streets in joint 8th place. It seems to be raining now. Why am I standing pointing at an imaginary top 10 of pub names, road names? Unsurprisingly, the top spot there was taken by High Street, followed just after that by High Road, which is pretty much the same deal, and then a bunch of other not particularly unique road and street names in London: London Road, Station Road, Church Street, and so on. The first road on that list that I think can make a decent claim to being a single continuous road in some sense is, and do we need a drum roll here, Uxbridge Road. And that perhaps shouldn't be so surprising because it's pretty long. It runs for 12 miles from Shepherd's Bush Green, which is where I'm standing right now, to, as the name suggests, Uxbridge. There's a total of 27 venues on CAMRA's online pub guide that have Uxbridge Road listed as their address. Again, I don't think all of them are exactly pubs. There's a hotel bar in there, a theatre bar, and a couple of places that look a bit more like restaurants. But once we've weeded all of those out, I think there are still a solid 20 pubs that have Uxbridge Road as their address. However, Uxbridge Road is actually another one of those what I'm calling mega roads, like the Great North Road. It starts out as it leaves Shepherd's Bush Green being called Uxbridge Road, but then on the way to Acton it switches to being called the Vale, back to being Uxbridge Road for a while at Acton, but then by the time it gets to Ealing it's called Broadway, and then I think there are later sections also called Uxbridge Road. You get the idea. The numbering also resets at least twice on its run from Shepherd's Bush up to Uxbridge. Are they all really the same road, or do we have several roads which happen to have the same name, like all those high streets? Once again, it still doesn't feel quite like a single road in the same spirit as Oxford Street or the Old Kent Road are. Cheers from the Princess Victoria on Uxbridge Road. I thought I would come here for this segment. Quite an impressive building, I hope you'll agree. CAMRA's site says that it was built in 1829. I think that's probably a typo, and what they meant to say was that it was first built in 1829. This is clearly a late Victorian or early Edwardian building. And a quick search through the archives of a journal called The Builder reveals that it was indeed rebuilt in 1899. The architect was William Mortimer Brutton, who I think we have encountered several times before on these videos, probably most famous for the Fitzroy Tavern in Fitzrovia. The Princess Victoria here is in red brick with lots of stucco decoration. There are Juliet balconies, gables with much more stucco decoration on them, a highly decorative corner piece, there's probably a proper architectural term for this, an oddly futuristic finial atop the corner there, possibly reminiscent of the BT Tower or maybe even the Space Needle in Seattle. And there are grills over the doors on the ground floor. Inside it has of course been somewhat gastropubbified in its modern incarnation, but there are still a few original Victorian features from around the time of that probably circa 1899 rebuild, including particularly this impressive horseshoe bar that has unusual panelling on the front of the bar counter there. The face of that has a design that's a tightly packed array of columns and or some sort of supports for the countertop, which projects slightly. And between those are arches with roundels, slightly reminiscent of crown glass, and octagonal panels beneath those. Elsewhere, some original cornicing, quite attractive, and probably some of the nicest features are these skylights. There is one in the main barroom area with some nice plasterwork around the sides, and if you go into the dining room, there are some with even more embellishment and decoration, including cherubs in the corner that I think I read somewhere have a passing resemblance to Martin Clunes. Bit weird. Ordered myself a pizza. It is lunchtime, bit peckish. Let's do the history while I'm having some pizza. So as noted, CAMRA mention it as being, I think they meant first built in 1829, and the earliest newspaper mention I could find for it is also in that year. I'm sure I don't need to remind you all of your history lessons from school. Queen Victoria was born in 1819 and became Queen in 1837. So at the time this pub was established in 1829, she would have been just 10 years old. You may also remember from those school history lessons that when Queen Victoria was born, she was 5th in line to the throne, behind 3 of her uncles and her own father. And if any of those uncles had children, that would push her further down the queue. However, by the time we get to 1829, the first of those 3 uncles had become George IV, whose only daughter, Princess Charlotte, was heir apparent but died a year later in childbirth. The second of those uncles, Frederick, had already died. The third went on to be William IV, but he had no surviving legitimate heirs. And Victoria's own father, Edward, died just a year or so after she was born. So I believe at the time this pub was established, 1829, by that time Victoria was 3rd in line to the throne, and given all the turmoil that had happened in her first decade, it seemed like a reasonable possibility she would indeed become Queen one day. Today, as noted, the pub has gone a little bit gastro, but they still had at least a couple of hand pumps on the bar. Alas, just like the first pub, the Old White Bear, the Harvey Sussex Best was off, so I went for Plan B, which was Timothy Taylor's Landlord. The third option is to only consider unbroken stretches of road that have the same name throughout, and the numbering also does not reset. I think we can all agree that they unambiguously refer to the same road in the same spirit as the Old Kent Road or Oxford Street. So let's go back to our list of top 12, top 10, top 12, and we'll notice that in joint 8th position, as mentioned earlier, are 5 different roads and or streets that all have 13 venues listed on CAMRA's online pub guide. I believe all 5 of these are also stretches of road where the name remains the same throughout and the numbering does not reset. So we have a potential tie-break situation here. 5 different roads or streets, all with 13 venues on CAMRA's pub guide site. And the final answer is probably going to come down to a judgment call about whether or not those places are indeed pubs. First of all, we have Upper Street. Of those 13 venues, we've already touched on this earlier because it forms part of the Great North Road. Some of those are things like Flight Club and Coffee to Cocktails, which are obviously not pubs. So I think we're left with 8 pubs on Upper Street. Kingsland Road. Again, 13 venues listed on CAMRA's site, but this is hipster central and I couldn't even quite figure out what some of those venues even were, but I'm pretty sure the majority of them were not pubs. I think probably only 4 of those venues are places that most people would genuinely consider to be pubs. Holloway Road, which happens to be where I am stood right now, another 13 venues there listed on CAMRA's site. I would say a solid 9 of those are definitely pubs. Kilburn High Road. A couple of those venues were closed at the time of making this video, so I think the current total as of March 2025 is probably 9 pubs again, so maybe neck and neck with Holloway Road. And finally, from that group of 5 is Mare Street in Hackney. I have done a video about Hackney. I would say that's a similar case to Kingsland Road. It's sort of hipster central, and a lot of those venues are not really pubs. Perhaps 6 at best places there that you could genuinely call pubs. So I think it ultimately comes down to a toss-up between Kilburn High Road and Holloway Road. I'm going to have a look at a pub on the Holloway Road, the Horatia behind me. Seems like I spoke too soon there. It's supposed to open at 4 o'clock, and I've actually been killing time walking up and down Holloway Road waiting for it to open, and it turns out that they can't actually open at 4. They don't have enough staff or something, so I'll try and find somewhere else. It may be the road with the joint highest number of pubs in London, but you're hard-pressed to find any that are actually open on a weekday in the afternoon. I've just passed, I think, one of the places that was listed on CAMRA's site. It's called Indie Beer, but it just looks more like one of those beer shops that happens to have a couple of tables and you can drink in. And here is the Coronet. I have covered that before in a video on Holloway, so I'd rather find somewhere sort of new and different. Cheers from the Hercules on Holloway Road. It's an Irish pub, and my visit happens to coincide with a bit of the Cheltenham Festival, so that's on the screens. Didn't do any interior shots. It is, I think it's quite a modern interior. It's a little bit sort of, manufactured Irish pub interior, but it's cute. It's nice, and the Guinness is good. And £5 a pint, can't complain in London. To recap, 9 pubs, I think, on Holloway Road, probably the same on Kilburn High Road. It's not a huge number, is it? I was quite surprised that by this very strict definition of counting pubs on a single road or single street in London, the best we seem to be able to manage at present, at the time of filming, is 9. Quite a stark contrast, isn't it, from London in its heyday, Oxford Street with its 27 pubs, Old Kent Road with its 37 pubs. Even Holloway Road, as recently as the middle of the 20th century, still had 20 or more pubs. Today, most of those have gone. So that was a bit different from the usual kind of video. Next time, I think I'll be back to the usual mixture of architecture, interiors, and pub history. Did manage to fit at least a little bit of that in during this video. So hope that was still interesting. Thanks for watching from here on Holloway Road. Cheers. See you on the next one.